At 11:47 last night, a claim started ripping through feeds like it was already confirmed. Canada just cut off America's lifeline. Not Canada raised a price. Not Canada threatened retaliation. Not Canada hinted at restrictions. Cut off. And if that were true, if Canada actually severed a major cross-border energy flow, then the next 24 to 72 hours wouldn't be politics. They'd be damage control, governors, grid operators, refineries, freight, inflation expectations, and a White House that treats humiliation as a national security event. So tonight on Dylan Sterling Analysis, I'm Dylan Sterling, and I'm going to do what the loudest videos never do. I'm going to open the folder, separate what is verified from what is weaponized narrative, and show you the uncomfortable reality. Canada doesn't even have to cut off the lifeline to prove it exists. Canada only has to touch it, even slightly, and Washington reacts like someone reached for the oxygen tube. We've already seen the rehearsal for this, and Trump's response when it happened was exactly what you'd expect. He erupted, not in a vague he's unhappy way, in a policy escalation way. So here's the plan. In this video, I'm going to walk you through, first, what people mean by America's lifeline, because it isn't one thing, it's a system. Second, the real precedent, what happened when Ontario slapped a surcharge on electricity exports to US states and warned it could shut power off completely, and how the White House responded. Third, the three ways a cutoff can happen: political cutoff, price cutoff, and physical cutoff, and why one of those is already happening even without retaliation. Canada's hydro-driven power exports have been falling because of prolonged dry conditions. Fourth, what Canada can realistically do if it decides to escalate, what Canada probably won't do, and what Trump's explosive response looks like in real terms: tariffs, border friction, and the deliberate use of uncertainty as a weapon. And at the end, I'll give you the three most plausible scenarios for what happens next, because the scariest outcomes are not the ones that go viral, they're the ones that look boring on paper. Let's start with the phrase America's lifeline, because it's not patriotic poetry, it's infrastructure, it's logistics, it's money, and the numbers are the tell. According to the Canada Energy Regulator's overview of 2024 Canada-US energy trade, Canada provided 61.7% of the crude oil imported by the United States, close to 100% of US natural gas imports, and 81.6% of the electrical energy imported by the US. So need you to hear what that last number means. It does not mean the US gets 81.6% of its electricity from Canada. It means of the electricity the US imports, the vast majority comes from Canada. Imports are a slice of the pie, but in the wrong place, at the wrong time, that slice becomes a pressure point. And that's why this lifeline story keeps coming back. Because if you're sitting in the White House, you don't care about averages. You care about fragile nodes, a refinery region configured for heavy crude, a winter heating corridor, relying on Canadian gas imports, a set of US states that import power across interties because it's cheaper or because it stabilizes peaks. So when you hear Canada cuts off America's lifeline, what you should translate it to is Canada is willing to use the interconnectedness of North America as leverage. Now, did Canada actually cut it off today? As of what I can verify, there has been no confirmed nationwide federal Canadian action that says we are terminating oil exports, or we are shutting off electricity exports, or we are banning natural gas exports to the US. What there has been is something more important for understanding what could happen next. There has been a real, documented case where a Canadian government entity, Ontario, moved to make electricity to US states more expensive and explicitly warned it could shut electricity off completely, and the US reaction to that was immediate escalation. This is why that Ontario episode matters, because it was the closest thing to a controlled experiment we've had in modern times. So let's rewind to the moment the lifeline got touched. March 10th, 2025. Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced that Ontario would begin charging 25% more for electricity exports, affecting electricity provided to Minnesota, New York, and Michigan, and said the surcharge was aimed at 1.5 million American homes and businesses. Ford did not stop there. He said this publicly: "I will not hesitate to increase this charge. If the United States escalates, I will not hesitate to shut the electricity off completely." That's not a vague threat. That's a politician describing the unthinkable out loud, that a cross-border power relationship can be treated like a valve. Now here is the part that most people missed, and it's why this incident is the blueprint for the next phase of the trade war. Ontario didn't need to physically cut anyone off to create pain. Ontario used a price instrument, a surcharge, a market rule change, and Ontario had the grid operator lined up to implement it fast. The Independent Electricity System Operator, ISO, implemented urgent market rule amendments creating a tariff response charge that could apply an additional charge on exports to the United States, and it documented that the minister directed it to apply $10 per megawatt hour on March 10th, then revise it to $0 on March 11th, while retaining the ability to reinstate a surcharge at any time. In other words, Ontario demonstrated that it could hit the US with energy leverage without turning the lights off, just by changing the price. Now watch the US response, because this is the Trump erupts moment, and it's not a metaphor. The very next day, March 11, 2025, Ontario suspended the surcharge after Ford spoke with US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and agreed to meet in Washington, and the White House reaction was explicit. AP reported that Trump said he would double planned tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum from 25% to 50%, framing it as a response to Ontario's price increases on electricity sold to the United States. AP also reported Trump condemned the use of electricity as a bargaining chip and threat, and said Canada would pay a financial price so big it would be read about in history books. Then when Ford suspended the surcharge, the White House pulled back on the doubling move, and Trump publicly acknowledged he appreciated the suspension. That is the key lesson. A single province touches an energy lever. Trump escalates tariffs immediately. The province pauses. Trump claims respect. That is a dominance loop. And now the internet is trying to sell you a story that Canada cut off the lifeline. But the real story, the one you should care about, is this. Canada proved the lifeline exists. The US proved it will escalate quickly when it's threatened. Now let's go deeper, because electricity is only one part of the lifeline, and in some ways it's the easiest part to dramatize and the hardest part to weaponize nationally. Oil is the opposite, harder to flip off, but far bigger in economic impact. So let's talk about the oil reality, because this is where people get seduced by simplistic slogans. You'll hear this line everywhere: America can replace Canadian oil. And yes, the US produces a lot of oil, but the issue is not only how many barrels exist, it's what kind of barrels they are, and what kind of refineries are configured to process them. The American Petroleum Institute has emphasized that the US primarily imports heavy crude oils from Canada and Mexico, and notes that in 2024, 62% of all US crude imports came from Canada, including 75% of heavy crude imports. AP has also reported that US refining infrastructure is geared toward heavier crude because of the historical need to import that type. So when someone says Canada cuts off the lifeline, and they mean oil, what they're implying is not gasoline disappears tomorrow. They're implying something more systemic: a pricing shock, a refinery input scramble, a shift in product spreads, and a political storm over inflation. Now, could Canada cut off oil exports? Technically, governments have tools: export duties, licensing, restrictions. But the real question is, would Canada actually do it, knowing how tightly its own oil export economy is tied to the US market? Because leverage cuts both ways, and even Canadian media and analysis outlets have pointed out that cutting off oil is talked about as retaliation, but would be a massive escalation with blowback. Even Reuters covered discussions from 2025 suggest Canada's energy minister said Canada could consider non-tariff measures such as restricting oil exports or levying export duties if escalation continued, but that framing is could, not has. So here's the correct way to think about the oil lever. Canada can threaten it. Canada can signal it. Canada can design instruments around it, export duties, targeted measures, but a full cutoff is the nuclear option. It's the kind of thing you say to create fear, not the thing you do casually. And that brings us to the third part of the lifeline: natural gas. The CER's 2024 snapshot says Canada provided close to 100% of US natural gas imports. Again, that's imports, not total US consumption. But imports matter at the margin, especially during winter demand spikes and regional bottlenecks. Now here is where the story gets weirder, and frankly more dangerous for the narrative. Because sometimes the cutoff isn't Canada retaliating, sometimes it's Canada simply not having surplus to export. Statistics Canada's energy statistics for November 2025 and December 2025 point to a major ongoing issue: prolonged dry conditions reducing hydroelectric generation, which reduced electricity available for export, and increased reliance on imports from the US. In November 2025, StatsCan reported electricity exports to the US fell sharply, and hydro generation posted year-over-year declines for months due to dry conditions. In December 2025, StatsCan reported exports to the US fell 34.5% to 2.3 million MBOH, while imports from the US rose 79.3% year-over-year to 3.1 million MBOH, again tied to dry conditions and lower hydro output. So when someone screams Canada is cutting off America's lifeline, I want you to hold two realities in your mind at the same time. 1. Canada can use energy as leverage through price instruments and policy threats. 2. Canada's ability to export electricity is also constrained by weather and hydro availability, meaning exports can fall even without retaliation. That second point matters because it changes how this could play out. If exports fall for physical reasons, and political tension rises at the same time, you get the worst combination, a shortage narrative that can be blamed on the other side, and that is where trade wars turn into public anger wars. Now let's do the competitor-style timeline, but with real anchors, because this doesn't happen overnight. It happens through escalation steps. Step 1. The trade war baseline. In 2025, Trump imposed broad tariffs on Canada with specific treatment for energy. Canada retaliated. Provinces began exploring non-tariff tools like electricity pricing. Step 2. The Ontario electricity test. Ontario implements a 25% surcharge on exports, warns it could cut off electricity completely, then suspends after talks, while the mechanism remains in place at $0 with the ability to return. Step 3. The US demonstrates the eruption pattern. Trump threatens to double steel and aluminum tariffs in response, condemns electricity as a bargaining chip, and then publicly claims respect when Ontario pauses. Step 4. The ongoing physical export decline. Hydro conditions reduce Canada's electricity export surplus, increasing imports from the US in late 2025, which tightens the power margin and makes any political export weaponization both harder and more inflammatory. That's the sequence. Now the internet is trying to jump from this to Canada has now cut it off completely. But the truth is more subtle and more strategically important. Canada has shown it can make the lifeline expensive and can threaten to shut it off. And those two things, price and threat, are often more powerful than a cutoff, because they change corporate behavior, and corporate behavior is the real battlefield. Now we need to talk about what lifeline means politically inside Canada, because this is where the fantasy versions of this story collapse. There is a persistent idea online that Canada can simply turn off oil and gas to punish America. But Canada is a federation, provinces matter, and the political economy matters. Even during the Ontario electricity episode, AP noted Ford called on Alberta to consider an export tax on oil, highlighting that energy leverage is fragmented across provincial politics. And Canadian reporting and analysis have repeatedly pointed out that restricting oil exports is not a clean, unified move. It's a national escalation that would face internal pushback, especially from energy-producing regions and industries tied to US export flows. So if you see a headline screaming, "Canada cuts off America's lifeline," ask which level of government, which commodity, which mechanism, because electricity from Ontario is not the same as crude from Alberta, and neither is the same as federal-level export policy. Now we're going to get into the heart of what makes this moment dangerous, not the cutoff, the belief in cutoff, because once markets and publics believe energy can be weaponized, the relationship changes permanently. And this is where Trump's explosive response becomes predictable. Trump's escalation logic is not mysterious. It's a three-part loop. 1. Treat economic ties as a loyalty test. 2. When loyalty is questioned, punish publicly and quickly. 3. When the other side blinks, declare victory and demand respect. We saw it with electricity. So what would Trump do if Canada truly escalated beyond a surcharge, if Canada imposed an export duty on oil, restricted flows, or actually reduced exports intentionally? There are 4 categories of response. Category 1. Tariff escalation. Tariffs are Trump's language. They're his instinctive tool. In the Ontario case, the response was to threaten doubling steel and aluminum tariffs. Category 2, border friction escalation. This is the one people underestimate. You don't even need new tariffs to slow a cross-border economy. You can increase inspections, change enforcement posture, create paperwork friction. You can make the border feel like a political choke point. Category 3, infrastructure leverage. And this is not theoretical. In February 2026, AP reported Trump threatened to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge and demanded ownership concessions, another example of using cross-border infrastructure as a pressure lever. Category 4, narrative escalation. This is Trump's real superpower, turning technical disputes into moral outrage. AP reported he condemned electricity as a bargaining chip and threatened a financial price that would be remembered in history books. That narrative isn't just venting, it's a weapon designed to justify escalation. Now let's talk about what Canada would actually do if it decided the relationship had entered the lifeline phase. Because Canada has options that are less suicidal than turn it off. Option 1, price instruments that are reversible. That's the Ontario model, not a cutoff, a charge, a surcharge, a tax mechanism. It creates pain, signals capability, and still allows de-escalation without admitting defeat. Option 2, targeted restrictions or export duties rather than a blanket ban. Reuters covered statements in 2025 suggested Canada could consider export restrictions or duties as non-tariff measures if escalation continued. Those tools can be designed to hit specific categories, specific regions, or specific time windows while trying to limit blowback. Option 3, electricity leverage through priority and pricing rather than outage. This matters because grid operators hate instability. A true shutoff can create reliability risk and trigger cascading political fallout, but pricing and scheduling can be used to shape flows without turning off the lights. Option 4, simply refusing to expand energy integration further. This is the quietest form of leverage, not cutting off existing flows, but declining future approvals, future projects, future expansions. It's the difference between I'm cutting you off and I'm not building the next pipeline, the next intertie, the next dependency. That kind of move doesn't trend on social media, but it changes the decade. Now I want to make one point that will sound counterintuitive but is critical. If Canada ever chooses to use energy leverage at the national level, the most likely first move is not oil, it's electricity. Why? Because electricity leverage can be localized, politically legible, and reversible, and it targets US states directly, states with governors, senators, and pressure channels into Washington. In Ontario's case, the export states were named Minnesota, New York, Michigan. That's not an accident, that's pressure design. And this is why Trump reacted so fast, because localized pain creates localized political backlash. Now let's talk about the phrase cuts off America's lifeline, because it's emotionally satisfying but analytically sloppy. There are 3 different realities that can be described as a cutoff. Reality 1, political cutoff. A government announces restrictions. Reality 2, price cutoff. The flow still exists, but it becomes expensive enough that the buyer effectively stops buying. Reality 3, physical cutoff. The flow declines because conditions change, drought reduces hydro surplus, constraints shift, and here's the punchline. Reality 2 and Reality 3 are often more likely than Reality 1. We have already lived Reality 2 in the Ontario case, and we have already lived Reality 3 in Canada's falling electricity exports due to dry conditions. So what the internet calls a cutoff is often either a price fight or a capacity fight, not a war declaration. Now let's put the pieces together and ask the real question. If Canada hasn't cut off the lifeline nationwide, why is this story spreading now? Because psychologically, both countries have crossed a line. They have started talking about interdependence as a weapon. Ontario's premier said he could shut electricity off completely. Trump said using electricity as a bargaining chip would trigger historic punishment. Once those words are said out loud, you can't unsay them. And the moment you can't unsay them, every future dispute carries an implicit threat. Will they do it this time? That is how trust dies, not in one betrayal, but in repeated rehearsals of betrayal. Now I'm going to walk you through what would actually happen practically if Canada escalated this into a bigger lifeline squeeze over the next 30 days. We're going to do it in 3 lanes: electricity lane, oil lane, and the politics lane, which is where the real war is. Lane 1, electricity. If Ontario, or Canada more broadly, reinstated export surcharges, you'd see immediate reactions in state-level energy reviews, like New York ordering officials to assess cost impacts, utility communications about exposure, and pressure on Washington to retaliate. But here's the thing, electricity imports are a small share of total US electricity use, so the impact is regional and political rather than nationwide and existential, which makes it the perfect tool for symbolic escalation. Lane 2, oil. If Canada truly restricted oil flows or imposed an export duty that meaningfully changed pricing, you'd see refinery feedstock adjustments, gasoline and diesel price pressure, and political blame games over inflation. But oil is also where Canada's self-harm risk is highest, because Canada's oil export economy is deeply tied to US demand and infrastructure. So the most likely oil move is not cut it off, it's price it differently, or signal capability, or prepare measures without triggering them. Lane 3, politics. This is where Trump's explosive response becomes most dangerous, because a White House that frames this as Canada threatening American families can justify tariffs, infrastructure threats, and aggressive negotiation demands. And Canada, if it escalates too far, risks pushing US domestic politics into a place where punishing Canada becomes popular. That's the trap. Now let's talk about the moment Trump erupts, because in the Ontario case we actually have a clear picture of the escalation rhythm. Trump sees a surcharge, Trump frames it as a threat to innocent people, Trump threatens doubling tariffs. Then when the surcharge is paused, Trump claims a victory narrative of strength and respect. This is important, because it tells you how Trump will respond to Canada touching energy again. He won't treat it as a technical trade dispute. He will treat it as a moral offense, and moral offenses justify disproportionate retaliation. Now here is the part that changes the meaning of Canada cuts off America's lifeline. Because if Canada ever chooses to weaponize energy at the national level, it will not do it because it wants chaos. It will do it because it believes the alternative is worse. Permanent tariffs, permanent humiliation, permanent vulnerability. And that's why the lifeline story is so sticky, because it's a story about sovereignty. When an ally depends on you, you feel powerful. When you depend on an ally, you feel insecure. North America has built a system where both are true at the same time. Canada depends on US market access. The US depends on Canadian energy inputs and cross-border stability. And the moment either side decides to treat that dependence as a weapon, the system shifts from partnership to hostage logic. Now let's get concrete again. If you are an American viewer, the question you should be asking is, am I personally exposed to this? So here's the simplest way to understand exposure. You are exposed if you live in a region where imported Canadian electricity contributes to pricing or reliability at the margin, particularly during peaks. You are exposed if your regional fuel markets rely on refinery outputs that depend on heavy crude import patterns. You are exposed if you work in industries that would be hit by tariff retaliation cycles, steel, aluminum, autos, manufacturing supply chains, because Trump's response tool is tariffs. And you are exposed if you rely on cross-border logistics infrastructure that can become a political choke point, like bridge openings and border policy posture. Now, if you are a Canadian viewer, the exposure is different. Your exposure is how much of your economy is tied to US demand. How much of your investment climate depends on stability? How much pain are you willing to absorb to reduce vulnerability? And this is where the most important non-obvious factor comes in. Canada's ability to weaponize electricity exports is currently complicated by the physical reality that exports have been falling due to hydro conditions. If you already have less export surplus, your ability to use exports as leverage shrinks. So the energy lever is real, but it is not infinite. And that's why price-based tools are so attractive. They let you create leverage without pretending you have unlimited supply. Now, let's shift to the part that determines whether this story escalates from viral to real. The next 72 hours won't be decided by YouTube titles. They'll be decided by 5 signals. Signal 1, official Canadian statements about energy measures, not social posts, not sources say, actual governmental language about export duties, restrictions, or non-tariff measures. Signal 2, provincial market operator actions. Ontario demonstrated it can create and suspend an export charge mechanism quickly through ISO. If those mechanisms are reactivated, you'll see it in official notices, not rumors. Signal 3. White House tariff posture. If Trump's team starts linking energy to tariff schedules again, especially metals, that's a sign they view energy leverage as a trigger for escalation. Signal 4. Grid and utility messaging. If U.S. state energy offices start issuing guidance or contingency reviews like New York did in March 2025, it's a sign the risk is being treated as operational, not rhetorical. Signal 5. The physical conditions. If hydro conditions continue to constrain Canadian export capacity, the narrative of cutoff can become politically weaponized even if the driver is drought and surplus decline. Now we're going to finish with the 3 scenarios because this is the what happens next section that the best competitor scripts do well. But I'm going to keep it real. Scenario 1. Controlled de-escalation. In this scenario, Canada does not cut off anything. Canada signals capability, but keeps actual measures limited or reversible. The US escalates rhetorically, maybe with targeted tariff threats, but both sides root into structured talks and avoid the nuclear options. This is basically what happened after the Ontario surcharge: pressure, talks, pause, partial rollback. Scenario 2. Rolling energy pressure. In this scenario, Canada, or a province, uses energy as an ongoing pressure tool through pricing, surcharges, export charges, or duties that can be adjusted. The White House responds with rolling tariff threats, and the relationship becomes a permanent escalation treadmill, not a cutoff, but a series of squeezes. This scenario is corrosive because it trains both publics to expect hostility and makes businesses price in instability. Scenario 3. Genuine rupture attempt. This is the nightmare scenario people are emotionally reacting to. A true attempt to restrict or shut off major energy flows. This is the least likely because the economic blowback is huge on both sides. But it's the one you can't ignore because political systems sometimes choose symbolic dominance over economic optimization. If this happens, Trump's response will likely be disproportionate, because that's what the Ontario case already hinted at. Electricity leverage triggers moral outrage, framing and rapid tariff escalation. Now let me bring it home. When you hear Canada cut off America's lifeline, treat it like a fire alarm, not because it's confirmed, but because it tells you what the relationship has become. A relationship where both sides know exactly where the pressure points are. And once pressure points are understood, every crisis becomes more dangerous because escalation becomes easier. So here's my question for you. Do you think the next phase of the US-Canada trade war is going to be fought with tariffs and speeches? Or do you think it's going to be fought with the quiet instruments that actually move pain, electricity pricing, border friction, and infrastructure leverage? This is Dylan Sterling Analysis. I'm Dylan Sterling, and I'll see you in the next one.